Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for downloading and watching this first author stroke co-director commentary of Discipleship Explored. My name is Barry Cooper. I'm the author, presenter, and executive producer of Discipleship Explored.
And I'm Nate Morgan Locke, and I was involved mainly in, I suppose, a co-directing, executive producing capacity for this, as well as carrying Barry's many, many bags.
Yeah, that's true. You did a great job on that. It was a crazy schedule, actually, wasn't it? I mean, we did, I think in 3 weeks, we covered 7 countries. We crossed 5 continents. And there were only 4 of us in the crew. It was myself, Nate, and Stephen McCaskill, the director, and Eric Skwarczynski, who was the cameraman,
That's
cinematographer. We always had trouble with his surname, didn't we? So we had a solution for that.
Skywalker.
Yeah.
Eric Skywalker.
Eric Skywalker. That's how he checked into hotels.
Mm.
So listen, the idea of these commentaries is we're not going to be doing all this kind of mindless banter. The idea is that we hopefully give a few little insights into the making of the series, but really the main purpose is to guide you as leaders as you come to run the series, so that you guys have some little tips and tricks and insights into the Bible study questions and the shape of the session, so that you're as fully prepared as you could possibly be going into each session. So it might be that a great time to watch one of these things would be just before you run the session in question. So, by the way, we just skipped over the Bible text at the beginning of this episode. When you watch the episode for real, you'll see that the Bible text is on at the beginning. There's a little clip of somebody from the episode, one of the interviewees, who cues up the theme for the session, and then you'll hear the sultry tones of Tabiti Anyabwile reading Philippians, and he replaces James Cosmo, who was the wonderful Scottish accent on the last version of Discipleship Explored. But now here we go with the
this is kind of the beginning proper. It's amazing
Right.
whenever you watch anything that's documentary style, just for your own personal pleasure, see how many different times it starts. And it's one of these wonderful things. We're now, 4.5 minutes into the episode, and we're now ready for the opening lines.
Yes.
And here they are.
I'm confident that
Thought we'd start off with the gospel straight away.
was buried, was resurrected,
Yeah.
and ascended, also that I
This was great. I think this was the first. Was this the first day of filming? We actually did it
how can I
for this. I think we
Yeah,
did.
it was. If you remember, we had originally we had scheduled 1 day of filming to do all of the filming that we needed for episode 1 and episode 8, both of them shot here in Philippi.
Yeah.
The problem was that we got to the end of the first day and we realized that half of our footage was unusable. There was a technical issue, which meant that we needed another day to then get a load of stuff again. But all of my talking bits to camera were shot in the very first day of us traveling. And that's why when you watch episode 8, you'll notice that the light is failing in episode 8. It starts to get a bit dimmer because we're towards the end of the day. But this is obviously shot. I think we pretty much shot it chronologically, didn't we, Nate? I'm trying to think.
I think we did actually. We moved through it. I remember I was working through your iPad and just scrolling through all these different pieces. But I think what was stunning about actually going to Philippi itself, rather, we could have shot this bit, I suppose, anywhere really, but to actually visit this kind of World Heritage site, and just to think how small it sort of feels. Now you don't hear much about this amphitheatre that we're looking at from reading the Bible, but just setting that context historically and geographically was quite eye-opening. I found just it really did bring Paul's letter to life in a way that I'm not sure I'd realised before.
And talking of which, historical accuracy, in one of the last things we changed before we went to duplication, was this map, because we got the map wrong of Paul's Paul's missionary
Yeah.
journey, which was not ideal. And I
It's
suddenly
awkward,
spotted it at
isn't
the
it?
very last moment.
Yeah.
Because you get kind of snowblind, I think, when you're watching the same episode again and again. You miss
Yeah.
stuff that you should really see.
It's interesting you sort of talking about the process of making this, and that being something where, I mean, originally we were going to shoot the whole thing up in, was it British Columbia or something like that?
Mm.
And then we kept changing plans, and the course of the filming schedule, as you said, we had spent an extra day in Philippi, and then ended up driving to Serbia rather than flying.
Yeah, that's right.
And this is exactly what you're talking about here at the beginning of Philippians, which is the plans that we make, and are we confident in our ability to carry those out, or are we actually trusting in God's plan, which may not be exactly what we would have chosen for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly right. Here's Simo Ralovic, who is a very well-known evangelist in Serbia. We were put in touch with him by Jeremy Marshall, who's somebody who is one of our trustees at Christianity Explored Ministries. And it's worth actually checking out Jeremy Marshall's blog. Do a Google search for that. And you can read Simo's story, and also Jeremy's story is remarkable. Trying to smuggle in Bibles behind the Iron Curtain and so on, absolutely remarkable. Simo, I think, as you'll see as we go through the series, becomes something of the star of the show, and he was an incredible character. Some of the people we interviewed, and I can relate to this myself as an introvert, we really had to work hard to coax them out into speaking to camera. That was not the case with Simo.
It wasn't.
Simo was
It
very
really wasn't.
garrulous, and it was a lot of fun hearing him speak. He just had so many stories. It was wonderful.
It's that stunning thing, though, of hearing someone who, you could make an entire series just on him. The testimony of grace in his life, and the work of the Spirit through his ministry and preaching. But it felt very awkward interrupting him to say, "Oh, would you mind just repeating that more succinctly so that we can use it in this video?"
That's right. But say that again, but in about 30 seconds. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Now, just in terms of running the Bible study in this session, you'll know, as if you've had a look at the Leader's Guide, the Leader's Handbook, the way it works is you welcome everybody at the beginning, and then you ask a particular question before you show this film. And the question is not meant to be answered at that point. It's just a question for people to hold in their minds as they watch the film. The idea of that is to help make people's viewing more focused and intentional, and hopefully helps people's minds not to wander as they're watching the film, because they know that they have a question that they're supposed to be trying to answer. And then you'll see in the handbook there's a little set of bullet points of summaries, a summary of the talk, and then you've got the Bible study questions. Just going to break off here to talk about Dear Judy. You'd met Judy before, hadn't you, Nate?
Yeah, Judy is one of these people where you don't think of her as I didn't think of her as a human being in some ways. It's really strange. I sort of thought of her as like this great big warm, joyful, gracious hug. That was just this overwhelming impression I had of her. But then to be interviewing her within this context and hearing, the sorts of change that had come about in her life through the gospel was just remarkable.
Yeah. She is one of those people who you feel like she's looking into your soul after you've met her, and you've talked to her for a few seconds. And I warned my wife, Lee, when she met her for the first time. I said, just so you know, you will be crying within about 20 minutes of meeting her, just so you're ready for that.
I mean, but I think it was maybe the second time I'd met her, and my wife, Kat, was there as well. And just within about 5 minutes, Kat was sort of just talking, deepest, darkest fears and anxieties, and Judy was just so great at that. So it was so exciting to be able to kind of partner with her
Yeah.
in making this again and hear more of her story.
Exactly.
And I suppose that might be a question some people have if they are familiar with the previous iteration of Discipleship Explored, is why there are suddenly all these interviews in there, and why we've chosen to fly around the world in that crazy schedule to make this. When, of course, it could have been much more straightforward, I suppose, much more simplified in terms of the making it.
Yeah,
So
we've got to get into
do you want
that
to just tell people the reasons for that?
Yeah, I mean,
what
very,
was
very
going on there?
briefly. Here's Lenny, by the way. Lenny's a youth worker in Missouri. Absolutely fantastic chap. Had a great laugh with him. Had not met him before we filmed him, but one of those guys immediately you feel, oh yeah, we could be best mates. You know, it's just great spending time with him. In terms of why we did the interviews, those of you who've done Christianity Explored will know that in some ways it's quite straightforward because you're just telling the story of Mark's gospel. You're just following the narrative of Mark. Similarly with Life Explored, you're following the narrative of Scripture as a whole. The difficulty we had with Discipleship Explored is, where's the narrative? Where's the story? Because it's essentially a letter that Paul is writing, which is packed full of theology. The most glorious theology, but nevertheless, it's not a story as such. Apart from, there's a couple of, obviously autobiographical bits where Paul talks about himself and then stuff about Epaphroditus and so on. So we were trying to think, well, how do we inject elements of story into this so that it'll be compelling, compulsive, and will get people hooked? And that's why we introduced the interviews, partly because we just wanted those biographical elements. It's also why I talk a lot more about my own experience in this series to the last one, because, again, I wanted there to be more elements of story. And then, of course, there's the larger meta story, if you like, which is the story of our journey around the world to meet these fellow believers and talk to them about the impact of Philippians on their lives. So, yes, lots of reasons for doing that, and hopefully people find that compelling to watch.
And I
Oh,
think
here we
one
are.
of the contextual things about that as well, which is helpful, is that Paul is in prison as he writes this, and he's writing to people who are suffering for the gospel. And so to go and hear stories of joy in Christ in suffering from the global church, hearing that was a great way to unpack that.
Indeed. Well, there we are. That's the end of episode 1. Join us for the commentary on episode 2. See you then.